I always thought I was in control. My life, my decisions, my success. It was all mine to shape, or so I believed. As a motivational speaker, I built my career teaching others to rely on themselves, to push through adversity, and to never look back. Don't wait for forgiveness, I'd tell my audience. You don't need it to succeed. I thought it was empowering. I thought it was the truth. But the truth, as I would come to learn, is far more complicated. It was a bright afternoon, and I was preparing to give one of the biggest speeches of my career. The event was sold out. Hundreds of people filling the auditorium to hear me talk about resilience, self-reliance, and the power of focusing on the future instead of the past. To them, I was a beacon of strength, someone who had climbed out of hardship and built a life of success. What they didn't know was that beneath the polished exterior, I was carrying a weight I refused to acknowledge. Behind every word I spoke about moving forward, there was a shadow of bitterness, of wounds left untreated. I had spent years harboring anger toward people who had hurt me, family, old friends, even strangers who had wronged me in small but lasting ways. And I didn't just ignore the pain. I used it as fuel. The truth was, I didn't believe in forgiveness. I believed in survival. The irony is, I barely survived what happened next. I was halfway through my presentation, the crowd hanging on every word, when it struck. A sudden, crushing pain in my chest stole the breath from my lungs. At first, I thought it was nerves, or perhaps exhaustion from weeks of travel and stress. But as I gripped the podium, gasping for air, I knew something was wrong. The murmurs in the audience grew louder, their faces blurring into a sea of confusion and concern. Someone called for help, but I couldn't focus. My vision narrowed, the room dimming until there was nothing left but darkness. And then, silence. But the silence didn't last. I found myself floating, weightless above my own body. I could see the crowd rushing toward the stage, their panic painted across their faces. Medics pushed their way through, shouting commands I couldn't hear. It was strange, watching it all unfold from a distance. My body, my career, my life. It felt so small, so insignificant from this perspective. Before I could process what was happening, a brilliant light appeared in the distance. It wasn't blinding, but it was radiant, warm, and alive. It pulled at me, inviting me closer, and I felt an overwhelming urge to follow. As I moved toward the light, I felt something else, an invisible weight lifting from my spirit. It was as if all the anger, all the bitterness I had carried for years, was being stripped away. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt free. But that freedom came with a price. "You have unfinished business," a voice said, soft but firm. It wasn't a voice I recognized, but it felt familiar, as though it had always been there, waiting for me to listen. "What business?" I asked, though no words left my lips. The light seemed to pulse, its warmth turning sharper, more focused. "You must understand the weight of what you carry. You must see what forgiveness truly means." I wanted to resist, to turn back, but I couldn't. The light grew brighter, and in an instant, everything changed. As the light enveloped me, I felt myself being pulled into another realm, one that was both unfamiliar and eerily comforting. The warmth of the light gave way to a gentle, glowing landscape. It was neither day nor night, but something in between. Colors seemed more vivid, yet softer at the same time. And there, standing in the distance, was a figure. At first, I couldn't make out who it was, but as I moved closer, my heart sank. It was my father. He stood there watching me with a look I couldn't decipher. It wasn't judgment or anger. If anything, it was sadness mixed with something else. Regret, perhaps? My father and I hadn't spoken in over a decade. Our relationship had always been strained, but the final blow came when he left my mother and started a new family. I had told myself I didn't care, that I was better off without him in my life. But now, standing in his presence, I felt a rush of emotions I had buried deep. "You're angry," he said, his voice gentle but unwavering. I opened my mouth to deny it, to push back, but I couldn't. The truth was too raw to hide in this place. "Yes," I admitted, my voice cracking. "I'm angry. You left. You left us. You left me." He nodded, his gaze never leaving mine. "I know, and I've carried that with me. But have you ever thought about what you've carried with you?" His words hit me like a wave. For years, I had blamed him for everything, my struggles, my fears, even my inability to trust others. But what had I done with that anger? I had nurtured it, fed it, and let it define me. Suddenly, the world around us shifted. The glowing landscape dissolved, replaced by scenes from my own life. It was like watching a film, except I was the main character. In one scene, I saw myself at a family gathering, refusing to even acknowledge my father's name when someone mentioned him. In another, I watched as I ended a friendship because of a petty argument, unwilling to forgive even the smallest slight. And then, there were the moments with my mother, how my anger toward my father had seeped into my relationship with her. I saw the hurt in her eyes as I pushed her away, blaming her for not standing up to him. Each memory cut deeper than the last. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. The voice that had spoken earlier, the one that told me I had unfinished business, returned. "This is what you carry," it said, "and it's not just about them, it's about you." The scenes shifted again, this time to moments where I had unknowingly hurt others. A young woman appeared, her face familiar but distant. Then I remembered. She had been one of my assistants during my early years as a speaker. She had come to me for advice after making a mistake, but instead of offering guidance, I had dismissed her with harsh words. Her face crumpled with pain as she walked away, and I watched as she carried that moment with her. It had been so small to me, so insignificant, but to her, it had been monumental. "You see," the voice said, "forgiveness isn't just about freeing others from blame. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of the harm you've caused and the harm you've endured." The landscape shifted again, and I found myself standing in a circle of people. Each one, someone I had wronged, hurt, or refused to forgive. My father was there, as were my mother, old friends, and even strangers whose faces I didn't immediately recognize. Each of them looked at me, their eyes filled with the same mixture of sadness and hope. One by one, they stepped forward, and with each step, I felt their pain. It was as if I was experiencing the emotions I had inflicted on them, the disappointment, the anger, the heartbreak. It was overwhelming, and I fell to my knees, tears streaming down my face. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'm so sorry." The first person to speak was my father. "I forgive you," he said simply. His words lifted something heavy from my chest, but it wasn't enough. "Forgive yourself," the voice said. I looked around at the circle of people, their faces filled with compassion, and realized that they weren't here to punish me. They were here to release me. But the release couldn't come until I let go of the bitterness I had held onto for so long. And then it happened. One by one, I began to speak their names, asking for forgiveness. My father, my mother, my friends, even the strangers I barely remembered. Each time I spoke, the weight on my soul grew lighter. And with each forgiveness I received, I felt something new: peace. The voice returned, this time softer, kinder. "This is only the beginning. Forgiveness is not a single act. It is a choice you make every day. When you return, you will face the same challenges, the same people. But now, you know the truth. The purpose of life is not perfection, it is connection. Forgiveness is the bridge." As the circle dissolved, I felt the light surrounding me grow stronger. It wasn't pulling me anymore. It was pushing me gently, guiding me back. As the light gently pushed me back, I resisted for a moment, wishing to stay in this space where everything made sense, where forgiveness felt tangible and healing was immediate. But the voice returned, steady and calm. Your purpose is not here. It's back where you came from. I didn't understand. What purpose? How could I, someone so broken, be entrusted with something greater? But before I could ask, the light shifted again, and I was pulled into another vision. This one wasn't about the past. It was about the future. I found myself standing on a stage, not the one from earlier that day, but a much larger one in front of an even bigger audience. The room was packed, yet the energy was different. Instead of pride, the air was filled with vulnerability. People weren't there to be inspired by strength. They were there to be healed by honesty. I watched myself speak, but this version of me was unrecognizable. I wasn't polished, rehearsed, or focused on performance. I was raw, sharing my story, this story about what had happened, about the weight of anger and bitterness, about how forgiveness had freed me. The audience wasn't clapping or cheering. They were crying. Some were holding hands. Others were hugging strangers sitting next to them. The walls that had divided them from themselves, from others, and from something greater were beginning to crumble. The vision zoomed out, and I saw how this one moment rippled outward. Those in the audience began carrying what they had learned into their own lives. Relationships mended, families reunited, communities healed. What had started as a single story of forgiveness became a movement of reconciliation. This is what you're being called to do, the voice said. But first, you must learn the depth of what forgiveness truly means. The vision faded, and I was once again surrounded by the warm, glowing light. But this time, a figure stepped forward. Unlike the faceless presence that had guided me until now, this figure was distinct and radiated an unmistakable sense of love and authority. I knew who it was before I even saw the face. "Do you know why you're here?" the figure asked, its voice gentle yet resonant, cutting through every layer of doubt within me. I hesitated. I think I do, but I don't know if I can do it. The figure smiled, and in that smile, I felt a reassurance unlike anything I had ever experienced. You were never meant to do it alone. That is the lesson you've been running from all your life. Forgiveness, connection, love, they were never meant to come from your own strength. They are gifts meant to flow through you, not from you. The words hit me with a force I wasn't prepared for. I had spent my life believing that strength meant independence, that to admit weakness was to fail. But in this moment, I realized how wrong I had been. True strength, I now understood, came from surrender, from allowing myself to rely on something greater than me. The figure extended a hand, and as I reached out, I felt an overwhelming wave of emotions, love, hope, and a peace so profound it brought me to tears. You will have the strength to forgive, because forgiveness is not yours to give. It flows through you. And when you forgive, you allow others to feel that same flow. It is a bridge, not just between you and them, but between you and the divine. I wanted to stay in this moment forever, to remain in the presence of this love. But the figure stepped back, and the light began to fade. It's time for you to go back. The next sensation I felt was weight, an unbearable heaviness that reminded me of the physical world I had left behind. My chest burned, and every breath felt like a struggle. I opened my eyes to bright fluorescent lights and the sound of frantic voices. "She's back!" someone shouted. I blinked, trying to focus, and saw the faces of paramedics hovering over me. One of them was holding a defibrillator, his hands shaking slightly as he looked down at me in disbelief. "You flatlined for 4 minutes," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and awe. "We thought we'd lost you." But they hadn't lost me. In fact, for the first time in years, I felt like I had truly been found. Recovering from the physical trauma was difficult, but the emotional transformation was far greater. The world felt different. Colors seemed brighter, sounds richer, and every interaction carried a weight I hadn't noticed before. I began to write down everything I had seen, every word that had been spoken to me, desperate to preserve the clarity I had experienced. But no matter how vivid my memories were, there was one truth I couldn't shake. I had to make things right. The first call I made was to my father. My hands trembled as I dialed his number, unsure of what I would say. When he answered, his voice cautious, I simply said, "Dad, I forgive you." There was silence on the other end, followed by a sound I had never expected to hear, his quiet sobs. For the first time in years, we spoke honestly, acknowledging the pain we had caused one another and beginning the process of rebuilding what had been broken. The next call was to my mother, then to the friends I had cut off, and even to some people I had barely thought about in years. With each conversation, I felt lighter, as if the weight of a lifetime of anger and bitterness was finally lifting. I eventually returned to the stage, but my message had changed completely. No longer did I speak about self-reliance and the need to move forward at all costs. Instead, I spoke about forgiveness, about how it had transformed me and how it could transform others. I told my audiences that forgiveness wasn't just a gift you give to others, it's a gift you give to yourself. It's not about condoning what was done or pretending the pain doesn't exist. It's about choosing freedom over resentment, connection over isolation. And as I watched people respond to this message, some with tears, others with quiet contemplation, I saw the same light I had experienced during my near-death experience begin to shine in their eyes. Standing on that stage again, I felt the weight of my new mission, not as a burden, but as a responsibility. My near-death experience had stripped away everything that once defined me. The pride, the cynicism, the false strength I had built my identity around. In its place, I found something far more meaningful: connection, vulnerability, and the transformative power of forgiveness. I no longer stood before my audience to project authority or strength. Instead, I shared my scars, my regrets, and the lessons I had learned during those 4 minutes when my heart had stopped. Every time I told my story, I saw faces light up with recognition, as if I were giving them permission to feel their own pain and begin their own journeys toward healing. The most powerful moment of every speech came when I asked a simple question: who do you need to forgive? The silence in the room was always palpable. I saw people shift uncomfortably in their seats, their faces reflecting the battles they had carried for years. But then, slowly, I would see a change. Eyes that were once hardened would soften, arms that were crossed would relax. And in that moment, I knew they were starting to let go of the chains that had bound them. Forgiveness is not easy, it's not immediate, and it's not something we do for the benefit of others. It's for ourselves. I had spent years believing that holding on to anger gave me strength, but in reality, it had drained me, left me bitter, and disconnected. What I learned in those moments beyond the veil is that forgiveness is the bridge that reconnects us, not just with the people who hurt us, but with the divine, with purpose, and with ourselves. My life now is far from perfect, but it's full of meaning, of joy, and of relationships that I once thought were beyond repair. The wounds are still there, but they no longer control me. Instead, they remind me of how far I've come. If you're listening to this, I want you to know that it's never too late to forgive. It's never too late to find peace. The light I experienced isn't just waiting for us after this life, it's something we can bring into the world, one act of compassion at a time. So I ask you, who do you need to forgive?